Okay, so today I just had a quick question for you, Kevin. I've always just been really curious about specifically the transits that were going on in America's birth chart in 1993, specifically like the winter and spring of 93. I was looking back at the dates because we had talked about the 1990s transits and how there were possibly some Mars transits going on at that time. And in February 26th was the first World Trade Center bombing. And then February 28th actually began the Waco, Texas standoff. It ended, unfortunately with adults and children dying on April 19th, 1993. But I just thought that was interesting that, it's just very specific timing of that February, end of February, beginning of spring 93 seemed to be significant in America's birth chart. So if we could just take a look at that.
So I'm going to show you, we're going to just look at the ephemeris here. So this will also be a little lesson in how to look at an ephemeris. So if you go to the chart selection area in astro.com, round up there is typically where you would pull up a normal chart. So I was looking at someone's progress chart, but a normal natal chart wheel would be what most of you would be looking at. Ephemeris is what we're going to look at here. So you can just pick any year that's of interest to you. So in this case, we're looking at 1993. And this will go, I don't even know, thousands of years. It will just calculate.
And I'm just to interrupt you, sorry, Kevin, but just so people know, Kevin remembers America's birth chart. So that's why we're not pulling it up, but we're actually looking at these transits in regards to America's birth chart. But, Kevin remembers the specifics of the chart.
And after this, I will go to America's birth chart and put the date in so that we can see it in transit. But because there was other stuff that happened in 93, wasn't there?
There was a lot with, I think that was when Clinton first was elected.
So that would have been the beginning of his administration, right?
Yeah. And there was actually, in the 90s, 91 was, 91, we began the Gulf War.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. I can't think of anything else very specific in 93, but I'm sure there was.
Yeah. Well, even just the beginning of the Clinton administration, many Americans would call that kind of like the golden era of America, at least since we've been alive. I know the economy was doing really well during the Clinton administration, and I don't know if it was because of Clinton or whatever, but that was the .com boom, and
it might have been the internet actually too. 91, it says the World Wide Web publicly debuts. So that was also that was the birth of
the internet. So there's a transit that fits perfectly for the description of that. Here you can see on the tables here, the sun, the moon, and it just then goes in order from closest to the sun, from furthest to the sun. So you have Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. And then these are both north node. This is the true node. This is the mean node. They're always like within a couple degrees of each other. Most astrologers, as far as I understand, use the true node. The mean node basically just averages how it travels to where the true node is where it actually is. And I don't know how all this stuff is calculated, but the true node doesn't, will be like stationary for a month and then move like 3 or 4 degrees and will actually go direct for a little bit. But it generally moves retrograde. And then this over here is Lilith. Don't even worry about Lilith. We're not going to cover that. And there's Chiron. So then you have the month, the year, and then this is the day. I believe this is, a lot of times it seems like it's a day or half a day off. So it's probably like midnight, or like 1 a.m. in Europe, I'm guessing. So it feels like it's like a day off to me, but it's close enough. What's of particular interest here, so this is during the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. Uranus and Neptune make a conjunction once every 170 years, roughly. So the birth of the internet very much fits the description of those two planets. In addition, Saturn passed through that space. It would have been, I think, in 1990, 88 through 90. It was within 15 degrees of those two planets. So you had a triple conjunction. You also saw like the USSR falling apart around that time, Berlin Wall and all that. and then the birth of the internet.
Yeah,
Here we are.
that was when we first got into the Middle East as well, with the first Gulf War.
Yeah, so that was in 91. So here you can see Uranus and Neptune both around 18 degrees in January, which means that Uranus would have been roughly 4.5 degrees per year for Uranus, roughly 2.5 degrees per year for Neptune. So Uranus and Neptune would have been opposite America's sun when we went into the Gulf War.
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting about Uranus and the Gulf War too is that was the first war that was televised. Like, I think I was like in junior high then, and I remember our teachers commenting on it, because these were men that maybe had been in Vietnam, and they were like, that night I remember watching, it was like, I guess these satellite videos, but they had it broadcast live on all the channels, and you're just watching the US bomb, I guess, Baghdad in real time.
So yeah, that Uranus-Neptune conjunction is significant. We could talk a lot about that, but what's I think most significant is that was the time when the internet was birthed, and 91 would have been Saturn would have still been in conjunction with them as well, or at least within 10-15 degrees. I think Saturn passed through that space. First made its conjunction with Uranus, I think it was in 88. And then would have made its conjunction with Neptune in 89 or 90. Yeah, it was still within range.
And I think I remember when we looked at I can't remember if it was the transits video or it was one of the videos when we looked at America's birth chart, and you talked specifically about how when you look at the charts of not necessarily people, but like a business or a country or a place, you would allow a 15-degree orb. Whereas when you're looking at a person's chart, typically the rule is 10.
That's the general rule for a person is 10-degree orb. And then Richard Tarnas his research is so comprehensive. I'm defaulting to him. And he said he noticed the influence even out to 20 degrees, but much more prominently within 15, though in some cases it went out to 20. So as far as then how a transit would affect the world, you could look at the Uranus-Neptune conjunction lasting like 15 years. If you allow 15 degrees, I mean, I know I was born in 84. Uranus and Neptune were 15 degrees apart then. And then they made their exact conjunction here in 93. So yeah, probably almost 20 years when they were within 15 degrees of each other. And so what's really interesting, the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune conjunction affected the whole world. The most prominent thing we saw was the birth of the internet, which in addition to the birth of the internet, this whole interconnectedness, and at the end of that, we saw the birth of the cell phone. So what's really interesting about that is when the location that this happened, which it was exact in the middle of Capricorn at 19 degrees, but they were close to each other for the whole time that it went through Capricorn. They were certainly within 10 degrees. So that conjunction happened opposite America's sun. And not only is it opposite America's sun, but there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in America's chart from Mars at I think 22 degrees of Gemini, 21, something like that, out through the North Node at the beginning of Leo. So there's like this huge grouping of planets. You could call it a stellium. I mean, certainly there's stellium in Cancer, but that also kind of spans beyond from the end of Gemini to the beginning of Leo. And so that conjunction then was opposite all of that, also in America's first house. I found, whether it be in the birth chart or in transit, anything in the first house seems to be a little more potent. So like in somebody's birth chart, any planet in the first house, more often than not, is prominent in that individual's personality. Yeah, that was all going on. But in addition to that, so you take that transit, which is certainly the most significant thing, two outer planets making conjunction opposite the sun. In addition to that, you have Mars here. So Mars would have turned retrograde somewhere towards the end of Cancer in December of 92. I could pull up the the ephemeris for that, but it's not really relevant. What's relevant is that Mars had passed over, made transited America's sun once, and then went retrograde. So Mars goes retrograde every 2 years. It's every other sign. So like we just had a Mars retrograde in Gemini. The next Mars retrograde will be in Leo in next year. Yeah, I think it might be at the beginning of 25, end of 24, beginning of 25, something like that. So then the Mars retrograde after that will probably be in Libra. It might start at the beginning of Scorpio. So, it's roughly every other sign. And so when Mars, you could look at the point Mars turns retrograde and the point that Mars turns direct. So if it's going, and then it turns retrograde and goes backward, and you can look at anything in that space where from the point where it turned retrograde to the point where it turned direct, Mars will transit everything within that space 3 times. And so it seems like there's anything that's in that space in between in the Mars retrograde path is going to be activated with the energy of what is indicated by Mars retrograde for the duration of not only the Mars retrograde, but the time before and after the Mars retrograde when Mars is moving through that space. So for America, you have that large grouping of planets in Cancer, and that Mars retrograde covered the space where Mercury and the Sun is, and was close to Jupiter. Looks like it turned direct at roughly 8 2/3 of a degree of Cancer. So I think Jupiter's at like 3 or 4 or 5 degrees of Cancer. So it was close enough. And so then these things happened within that time period. So Mars had just turned direct roughly 10 days prior to these things happening, and was then applying or moving towards America's sun for what would have been the 3rd conjunction to America's sun. In addition to that, you had Jupiter. Transiting Jupiter was conjunct America's natal Saturn, also retrograde, making an exact square to America's sun at that time. And you have Mercury had stationed retrograde. So it would have been stationary, not still technically direct, but stationary and about to turn retrograde in an opposition to America's Neptune and square to America's Mars in its sign of fall and detriment in Pisces. And so that's also something that's relevant to this discussion, is that I found, particularly in transit, though also in the birth chart, that when a transiting planet is in its sign of fall, it has it's more likely to have an unpleasant effect. The same could be said for its sign of detriment, though I would expect its sign of detriment to perhaps be less potent, to where the sign of its fall seems to have more of a potent and unpleasant effect. I'm willing to adjust my stance on that if over time I observe more that's contrary to that, though that's what I've seen up to this point in my career. So you have...
Sorry to interrupt. I just have a question about that, specifically about Cancer. Like, the transits aren't happening in the 4th house, but it being in the sign of Cancer, which is like, I know we're looking at a country's chart, not a person's chart. But still, that would be that feeling of like home and children and that kind of like more intimate place, I guess. And just thinking that, like, we're specifically looking at that first World Trade Center bombing and Waco, Texas, and it was this like explosive energy on American soil.
Absolutely.
Whereas like those transits, like things happening maybe in 91 were more on foreign soil, like, the fall of Russia or the fall of the USSR and the Gulf War transit.
Yeah, and I would imagine the landscape of America changed in some way after that. So this is a good lesson in looking at short-term transits from from Mars and Mercury will very often activate like a long-term transit. So in this case, the transit of Uranus and Neptune moving opposite America's sun, and then applying to an opposition to Mercury and a conjunction to Pluto. That was like a long period of time. You could say essentially the entire like decade of the 90s would have, certainly Neptune would have been in that space, and then Uranus would have been in that space for the majority of it. So then we have a Mars retrograde and a Mercury retrograde lining up with significant points in America's chart at the same time. At the same time that there's a significant long-term transit. The other thing that's worth noting here is the node. So the south node would have just transited America's Mars, and then the Mercury retrograde would have also then been square to the transiting node, and then the transiting node would have transited America's ascendant in a couple months after that. Looks like if you're using 12 degrees, it would have been in April and May. So
and the exact Waco, when Waco ended was April 19th.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we could even look at that. That would have been the transiting node was almost conjunct America's ascendant, though. That's also right when Uranus and Neptune stationed retrograde, and that's also right around when Mars finished its transit of Cancer. So you said the 19th. So yeah, at that point, that's actually right after Mars. So Mars was still conjunct America's natal Mercury and opposite Pluto right at that time. Yeah, wow. All right, so I'm putting in February 28th here. Put up the transits. So yeah, so there you can see Mars is transiting America's sun. The Mercury retrograde here, opposite natal Neptune, square to natal Mars. North node transiting the ascendant. Jupiter conjunct Saturn, square to the sun. And then you could even throw Saturn in, making a wide conjunction to the moon. So
one more date from the 90s, and this is like a random date, but I just, because you have the transit chart up, can you look up July 17th, 1996? I'm just wondering if there was any.
Yeah, and I looked at this when you first sent it to me.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I know. I'm just wondering now that we're looking at the 90s transits. I mean, and maybe there wasn't anything significant on that date, but. And just the reason I'm pulling up that date specifically is that was, we were looking at significant dates in the 90s, and that July 17th, 1996 was Flight 800. So it took off from JFK, and everyone on board died. And there's always been a lot of questioning as to if there was accidentally a heat-seeking missile hit the plane, or if it was what the official story was, that there was, something had gone wrong in the plane. But a lot of the witnesses had reported seeing something. So it's always been this very big kind of conspiracy type thing. But I've personally always, just because I lived there at the time, and I've always found, I don't know, it had a very Neptunian quality to me personally, I thought.
It's certain, and there was plenty of activity here. So this little... So look at this. Here we go. First we can see Venus had just gone direct. So the Venus retrograde in that period prior to this had spanned from 28 degrees of Gemini. So then it retrograded over Mars and to just before Uranus, it stationed direct then at around 12 degrees of Gemini. And then would have went direct, and you said it was on the 19th of July?
The 17th. Yeah.
17th. Okay. So then it was applying to be conjunct to Mars, and then also right around the midpoint. I don't know how the Venus archetype fits into this, but what I found is when there's just more planets around a point, stuff happens, and it doesn't necessarily fit like the energy of one particular planet. Mars, once again, passing through this space. In fact, it was almost exactly at the Mars return for America. So Mars was at 24 degrees of Gemini. Jupiter was retrograde opposite America's sun. Uranus was around the south node, and Neptune was opposite Mercury conjunct Pluto. And then it looks like you also have the north node transiting Saturn and square America's sun. Yeah, there was actually quite a bit of activity right around there. Let's see where the full moon was. Looks like the full moon would have been at like 9.5 degrees of Capricorn. So yeah, it was also right around. Oh, and then the new moon would have been set on the 17th. Yeah, it looks like the new moon was actually exactly conjunct America's Mercury, like the day of or before.
I mean, and when we think of Mercury in communication, I mean, there was a lot of people felt like
it was
there
a
was a lot of
miscommunication. Yeah. And not deliberate. Like, let's just blow up this plane for some bizarre, nefarious reason.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, the conspiracy theory is that it was accidental, and most of the people that were on the plane were young, very young French students. So the French government obviously was involved because most of the plane was French citizens. Basically, what happened, I think, was the FBI came in and they pushed out the NTSB, and they basically pushed out the people that normally would have been in the investigation. And then I think the CIA, like it was like the FBI and the CIA took over and they pushed the NTSB out. There's like documentaries about it. Like I've always wished that, when you get to the end of this lifetime, you could find out which conspiracies were true.
Well, some people who've had near-death experiences say you do get to find that out when you're on the other side. You can ask any question and it will be answered.